Now, as I told you before, tests are first-class citizens in your code base. They're as important as the production code. So as you write tests, it's crucial, it's absolutely crucial to refactor your tests and make them cleaner. So if you look at the tests we have written so far, you can see a level of duplication. In these last two tests, we have this line for generating a token, and these few lines for sending a request looks very similar in all these tests. So in this lecture, we're going to refactor these tests using Masha's technique. So, as I told you before, first we define the happy path, and then in each test, we'll change one parameter that would simulate an edge case. So, let's go on the top. So here's our test suite. We're going to define the happy path. So we define this constant called execute, set it to a function, and in this function, we'll send a request to the server. So let's get a template here. I'm going to get this request that includes the authentication token. So let's cut this from here. Now let me show you something. To quickly jump back to our execute function, in VS Code, you can press Shift, Command, and O on Mac, or Shift, Control, O on Windows. Here we can see all the variables and functions you have defined in this module. So we want to get back to our execute function. That's a quick shortcut. Paste the request here. Now we simply return it. We can exclude await here, so we'll simply return a promise, and we'll have the caller of this function await that promise. Now here we want to send a valid request, so we should have the customer ID and the movie ID as well as the token. Now we want to set these variables to valid values in the before each function. So let's have a look. In before each, we have a valid customer ID and movie ID. We just need to set the token here as well. So let's define token as a variable. And then here in before each, we set token to a new user that generate auth token. So we're done with our happy path. Now let's modify each test accordingly. So here's our first test where we check for the authorization. Instead of these three lines, we're going to call execute, await it, and get the response. Now the parameter we want to change is token. We set that to an empty string. For our second test, we don't need this line anymore. We're going to set customer ID to an empty string. And then call execute, await it, and get the response. Now, there's also a different approach. So instead of setting customer to an empty string, we could define an object, call it payload. We would add that object in the body of the request. And then here, we could delete the customer property in the payload. So payload.customer ID. That's another approach. Either way, if we don't have a customer ID in the body of our request, our current implementation is going to return a 400 error. So back here. And finally, our last test. Again, we're going to delete all this noisy code, set movie ID to an empty string, and finally call execute. Save. Back in the terminal. All tests are passing. So we have implemented these three test cases. Your exercise is to implement this next test case. We should return 404 if no rental found for this customer and movie combination.